The history of the world is, in so many ways, defined by the history of its great city. When we think of the cradles of civilization, names like ancient Thebes and Memphis, the long-standing capital of Egypt, they just leap to mind. Later, of course, you see the rise of Athens, the crucible of Western philosophy, and Rome, the eternal city that conquered most of the known world.
And that trajectory, it just keeps going, even beyond antiquity.
Yeah.
We move into the Byzantine era with Constantinople, the new Rome, a city so grand, so wealthy, that the Vikings gave it the name Miklagard, which, just means the great city.
Exactly. And in our modern era, London, New York, and Shanghai continue that legacy as these global centers of commerce, finance, and power.
Right.
But if we were to compile a list of the greatest cities in history based purely on their impact on knowledge, on science, and global trade, there is one that often gets, I think, overlooked. Yet it held a truly astonishing position in the ancient world. And that city, founded almost on a whim, is Alexandria.
It's so critically important that we establish Alexandria's place right at the start, because it was a disruptive force. I mean, it wasn't built on existing power structures like Thebes or Rome. It was a completely new creation.
Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, and he puts it deliberately on the western edge of the Nile Delta.
A very strategic location. It links the Mediterranean and the Nile River system perfectly.
But here's the interesting part. Alexander spent very little time there. He founded it, he ordered the basic grid layout, and then just moved on to conquer the rest of his colossal empire.
And it was only in the century after his death that Alexandria truly exploded into this global preeminence.
And it became the global city par excellence.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Within 100 years, it wasn't just the most populous city in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was arguably the most important one. It was the financial, commercial, and intellectual heart of the entire Hellenistic world.
We are talking about a place where genius was literally institutional. This was the hub where scholars, drawn by the largest library humanity had ever conceived, were making discoveries that wouldn't be surpassed for over 1,000.
And you just have to think about the depth of those breakthroughs for a second. This is where Eratosthenes was not just suggesting, but actually calculating the circumference of the Earth.
With remarkable accuracy.
With remarkable accuracy. This is where Euclid systematized geometry. And most startlingly, this is where Hero of Alexandria developed a working prototype of a steam engine.
A steam engine, a device we associate with the Industrial Revolution 1,700 years before it transformed Europe.
Alexandria was the technological and intellectual apex of its age, no question.
And crucially, all of this, the trade, the science, the monumental architecture, was made possible only because of the unique 3-century reign of one specific, highly adaptable, and sometimes horrifically dysfunctional dynasty, the Ptolemies.
And to really grasp the Ptolemies' achievement, you have to first understand the state of the land they inherited. By the time Alexander and his Macedonian army arrived in 332 BC, Egypt was, a shadow of its former self. The great power and monumental building of the 3 traditional golden ages, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, were deep, deep in the past.
Right. We associate the Old Kingdom, that's roughly 2700 to 2200 BC, with the iconic pyramids and the Sphinx.
Exactly.
Then you have the New Kingdom, arguably the greatest period of imperial power during the mid-second millennium.
And the New Kingdom pharaohs, rulers like Thutmose III and Ramesses II, they were not primarily focused on pyramid. They were focused on expansion. They built magnificent temples, erected massive obelisks, and projected power deep into Nubia in the south, across the border into Libya, and northwards into the Levant. That was the high watermark of Egyptian influence.
But then came the collapse. Every empire eventually faces a crisis, and Egypt's arrived around the 12th and 11th century. It's part of that near-simultaneous collapse of centralized power across the entire Eastern Med, what we call the Late Bronze Age collapse.
And a major vector for that collapse was a set of, poorly documented but devastating marauders known to us only as the Sea. The sources are confusing, but these were powerful, mysterious, amphibious invaders who hit the coasts of the Levant, Anatolia, and even the Nile Delta.
And while the Egyptians ultimately repelled them, the wars were exhausted. That crisis ushered in what's called the Dark, or the Third Intermediate Period. The defining characteristic was the complete breakdown.
Total breakdown. The unity that had marked the New Kingdom just fractured. So instead of a single powerful pharaoh ruling from a unified capital like Memphis or Thebes, the realm was divided. You had rival dynasties operating at the same time, one ruling Upper Egypt in the south, while Lower Egypt splintered into several small, weaker principalities.
And that disorder became an invitation for foreign rulers. We first see the Nubian 25th dynasty take control ruling from about 744 to 656.
Right, and they operated out of Napata in modern Sudan, but they were certainly trying to embrace the traditional role of the pharaoh. They even built their own style of pyramid.
But the true end of native rule came swiftly after that. They were expelled first by the powerful Neo-Assyrian Empire out of Mesopotamia under Ashurbanipal, and then, after a brief attempt at re-establishing native rule, the massive power of the Persian Empire swept westwards around 525.
And that's 2 full centuries, 2 centuries of mostly continuous Persian rule before Alexander arrived in 332 BC.
So when Alexander conquered Egypt in a blindingly swift campaign, he wasn't displacing a beloved native pharaoh, he was displacing an occupying Persian governor. The ground was just ripe for a change.
And Alexander's death, just 9 years later at age 32 in 323 BC, created instantaneous, unprecedented chaos across the entire empire, which stretched from Greece to India.
Okay, let's unpack. He had an infant heir, Alexander IV, born a month after his father's death. But there was no mechanism for a regency that satisfied the massive generals who had helped build the empire.
Exactly. This triggered the infamous Wars of the Successors, or the Wars of the Diadochi, and they dragged on for 4 decades, defining the next generation. It was a massive, bloody scramble for the pieces of the world's largest empire. Every general wanted to be the next Alexander.
And Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions and leading generals, the sources describe him as cunning and brilliant. He moved quickly. He established Egypt as his personal domain. But he didn't initially declare himself king. He presented himself as the appointed governor, the custodian of the infant heir's interest.
That was very cautious, very smart strategy. While other generals immediately started fighting massive battles for control of Persia or Anatolia, Ptolemy stayed focused on securing Egypt. And he took a specific, highly symbolic action that proved he wasn't just interested in being a temporary governor.
He stole the body. This is where it gets. When Alexander's body, embalmed, naturally was being transported back to Macedon for a proper burial, Ptolemy intercepted the cortege in Syria.
He brought the remains back to Egypt, initially to Memphis. It was an act of profound political audacity. By claiming Alexander's body, he wasn't just claiming a relic. He was declaring Egypt the true spiritual and political heart of the new Hellenistic world.
And later, he moved the body to a magnificent, formal royal tomb in Alexandria, the Sema, became a pilgrimage site for centuries.
That move solidified his position. Over the next 2 decades, as the wars raged around him, Ptolemy consolidated his holding, claiming not just the Nile Valley, but crucial surrounding territory: Cyprus, the wealthy province of Cyrene in Libya, and strategic parts of the Levant.
So by 305 D, when the dust was beginning to settle slightly, and his former comrades, like Antigonus, were proclaiming king, Ptolemy followed.
He took the title Ptolemy I Soter, meaning savior or deliverer.
And perhaps the greatest structural advantage he gave his nascent dynasty was just longevity. He was born around 369 BC and lived to be nearly 87, dying in 280. That's 40 years in power.
And that 40 years of continuous stable rule was absolutely crucial. The other successor kingdoms were prone to rapid power shifts, assassinations, territorial loss. Ptolemy's long reign allowed the Ptolemaic state to coalesce, to organize its economy, its administration, and its military without the existential threat of civil war or invasion that plagued the other Diadochi state. He was the anchor that secured the next 3 centuries.
Okay, so let's unpack. Ptolemy was a foreign Macedonian. He came in with Greek-speaking soldiers, administering a land that had 3,000 years of unbroken pharaonic. He claimed control through military might, but military might. How did the Ptolemies gain the necessary consent, well, not just from the Greek colonists, but from the populace?
This required a kind of cultural genius, a brilliant and ultimately essential strategic move we can call deep cultural osmosis. The Ptolemies had to be, in a sense, schizophrenic rulers. They established a political template where they presented themselves as both Macedonian conquerors and as de facto native pharaohs.
Yes, they were blending their Greek cultural background with an adoption of Egypt's deepest, most sacred traditions.
Precisely. They had to manage that dual identity on the ground, and it had to be visible, institutionalized, and practical.
How do you do that?
Well, it was codified immediately. We have the incredible evidence of the satrap still, produced as early as 311 BC.
And what does that elaborate stone tablet?
It was created to commemorate Ptolemy I's victory at Gaza, but it was pure propaganda aimed at the Egyptian elite. The text was written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, the language of the pharaoh. More importantly, the visual depictions showed Ptolemy I wearing the traditional Egyptian ceremonial dress, surrounded by key Egyptian deities like Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky.
So he was visually adopting the pharaonic template. He was signaling to the long-established temple priests and nobility, I respect the old ways. I am your new legitimate pharaoh.
That's exactly it. And the blending wasn't just ceremonial, it filtered into the actual legal and administrative structure. They maintained two parallel systems. The Greek system, based in Alexandria, was the language of the military, the high administration, and commerce.
But they didn't just get rid of the existing Egyptian civil and religious structure.
No, not at all. They kept it. Land ownership, local village administration, and the powerful temple estates were generally maintained under Egyptian law, administered by Egyptian scribes, but now overseen by Greek bureaucrats.
And we should also mention the Kourouchis, right? The very foundation of Greek settlement in Egypt was tied to their military.
Absolutely. The Ptolemies didn't want to just rely on mercenaries. They wanted a committed military population. So they granted land called kleroi to Greek soldiers in exchange for mandatory military service. These Greeks settled on the land, formed military colonies, and became a crucial, privileged caste that provided both the dynastic protection and the administrative backbone for the regime.
It was the physical manifestation of foreign rule.
It was. And yet, over time, these two groups began to merge. Cultural osmosis took hold. Bilingualism became widespread, especially in the bureaucracy. Both Greek and Egyptian populations began adopting elements of each other's religion. The Ptolemies even encouraged this by creating new syncretic gods, like Serapis, which blended Greek and Egyptian characteristics.
And the most profound testament to the ultimate success of this hybrid state is, of course, the Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone. We know it today as the key that unlocked hieroglyphics. But in its own time, what was it?
It was a simple, though crucial, administrative document, a royal decree issued in 96 BC under Ptolemy V.
Right, and the decree itself wasn't spectacular. It was mostly about tax concessions granted to the priests. But the fact that it was inscribed in three scripts, hieroglyphic for the priests, Demotic for the daily Egyptian script, and ancient Greek for the language of the court, that perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of the state.
That's the aha moment for the listener, right? This single stone proves that the government needed to communicate in three different languages and script to ensure the loyalty and compliance of its two core populations.
And that trilingual format became the bridge centuries later. When Napoleon's forces rediscovered it in 1799, scholars like Jean-François Champollion were able to use the known Greek script to finally decipher the previously unreadable hieroglyphic, all thanks to Ptolemaic.
So Ptolemy I established the structure, but his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, took over fully in 282 BC. He truly maximized the kingdom's commercial power and intellectual output.
He was an incredible administrator and promoter of culture, but he also cemented the dynasty's most controversial and, frankly, unnerving internal customs.
And this is where it gets really interesting. His name, Philadelphus, literally means sibling lover, and it's a black irony that defines this era. He adopted the long-established Egyptian pharaonic custom of marrying his full sister, Arsinoe II.
It was an incredible political statement. By marrying his sister, he was elevating himself from a mere Macedonian king to a god, just like the pharaohs of old who often married within the family to preserve the divine bloodline. He and Arsinoe were deified during their lifetimes as the Theoi Adelphoi, the sibling god.
That is maximum cultural osmosis.
It is.
Yet for a man whose title meant sibling lover, his family life was murderous. He didn't hesitate to have several of his other brothers murdered to ensure his complete control over the kingdom.
And this capacity for extreme violence was definitely reflected in his foreign policy. His reign, lasting until 246 BC, was marked by near constant military engagement. The majority were the Syrian War's perennial border clashes against the Seleucid Empire over control of the rich coastal provinces of the Levant.
But the Kremenidian War, fought from 267 to 261, showed the real reach of Ptolemaic power. Why did Ptolemy II get involved so far afield in mainland Greece?
Because he was funding a coalition against the Antigonid rulers of Macedon, the power that still claimed to be the direct heir to Alexander. Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta were desperate to break free, and they solicited Ptolemy II's substantial.
And he didn't just send money. He dispatched a massive fleet and army in region and mainland. And although the Ptolemaic general was eventually defeated, the fact that Egypt could sustain a war this far from its base proves that under Ptolemy II, the kingdom was financially and militarily the strongest Hellenic. He was a global player in the Mediterranean.
And the wealth that funded this vast military machine came directly from Egypt's unique geography. Egypt is, geographically, the only major power with easy access to both the Mediterranean world and the Red Sea, and via the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean.
This was absolutely priceless for commerce. Ptolemy I had started the exploratory voyage, but Ptolemy II saw the true boom. He realized he could bypass the overland Silk Roads entirely for maritime trade.
And he massively invested in infrastructure. He restored and built entire chains of Red Sea ports, most famously Berenice and Myos Hormos. These ports were essentially military-protected, royally administered hubs designed specifically to receive goods shipped from Arabia, down the African coast, and across the Arabian Sea from India.
And the flow of goods was staggering. They were bringing back frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, cinnamon and pepper from India.
And luxury bulk silks, jade, gemstones from even further afield, reaching as far as China via intermediaries.
So the efficiency of the Ptolemaic trade system, combined with heavy royal taxation on all imported luxury, filled the Alexandrian treasury to burst. This cemented Alexandria's place not only as a commercial hub, but as a financial superpower.
A superpower capable of funding the largest military and the greatest cultural project the world had yet seen.
And that massive wealth allowed Ptolemy II to fully realize the vision of making Alexandria the undisputed scientific and cultural capital of the ancient world.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the Great Library and the Mausoleum.
We often hear about the library as a single magnificent building, but the sources suggest it was far more complex. What exactly was the Mausoleum, and how did it function differently from, say, the temples nearby?
The Mausoleum, which literally means seat of the muses, that was the true innovation. It was conceived by Ptolemy I, but fully realized by his successors as a royal research institute. It wasn't just a building, it was an integrated complex. It included the massive main library hall for scrolls, yes, but also dedicated lecture halls, botanical gardens, astronomical observatories, dining halls, and living quarters for resident scholars.
It essentially functioned as the world's first state-sponsored university, but with unlimited royal finance.
Exactly. It was inspired by the philosophical academies of Plato and Aristotle back in Athens, but it was differentiated by its mission. While Athens remained the center of philosophy, the Mausoleum was specifically geared toward scientific, mathematical, and literary inquiry. The scholars weren't just students, they were salaried researchers, paid by the king to live and think.
And the sheer effort they put into collecting scrolls is legendary, and sometimes ruthless. They didn't just wait for books to show up, did they?
Oh no. Their acquisition methods were incredibly aggressive. The legend goes that the Ptolemies even developed a policy where any ship arriving in the harbor had its scrolls seized. The texts were then copied by state scribe, and the copies were returned to the owners, while the originals were kept for the library.
That's intellectual piracy on an imperial. And the goal was not just to collect knowledge, but to standardize and catalog it.
And that cataloging was essential. We know that the library grew rapidly, accumulating anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. The scale is perhaps best illustrated by the now lost catalog, the Pentateuch, compiled by the poet and scholar Callimachus of Cyrene in the mid-3rd century BC.
A physical catalog running to 120 scrolls itself, just to list the contents. That suggests a truly staggering level of organization.
And this repository drew the greatest scientific minds of the...
Let's focus on the break, because they are truly shocking in their modernity. Eratosthenes, the mathematician, geographer, and astronomer, he was the one who calculated the circumference of the Earth. How did he even do that with the tools available?
It's an act of pure geometric brilliance. Eratosthenes observed that on the summer solstice, the sun cast no shadow at noon in the city of Syene, modern Aswan, meaning the sun was directly overhead. But at the same moment in Alexandria, hundreds of miles north, it did cast a shadow.
So he essentially had two data points, a 0-degree angle at Syene and a measurable angle at Alexandria.
Precisely. He found the angle was about 1/50th of a full circle. By knowing the distance between the two cities, which he either commissioned to be measured or relied upon existing travel records, he could multiply that distance by 50. His calculation was remarkably accurate, coming within 5 to 15% of the true circumference. This was done in the 3rd century BC.
That is profound. And then there's the medical research. Herophilus pioneered the scientific dissection of human bodies.
That was a massive leap forward. Previous medical knowledge had been based mostly on animal anatomy or speculation. The Ptolemies, perhaps because they were foreign rulers, were less concerned with local religious taboos regarding the treatment of the dead. This royal protection allowed Herophilus to move forward with human dissection, leading to the identification of the central role of the brain, the distinction between veins and artery, a much clearer understanding of human physiology.
And while Athens retained philosophy, Alexandria became the definitive center for technical and mathematical inquiry, even as the dynasty began to decline politically.
Absolutely. Think of Apollonius of Perga in the early 2nd century BC, whose detailed work on conic sections, ellipses, hyperbolas, and parabolas is foundational to understanding orbital mechanics today.
And then there's Hipparchus, working in the mid-2nd century BC, developing trigonometry and making incredibly detailed observations about the equinoxes and the movement of the tide. This was systematic, verifiable science, not just philosophical.
And let's not forget the engineering marvel. Hero of Alexandria, operating in the 1st century BC, developed far more than just mathematical theory. He created the aeolipile, which was functionally a working reaction steam engine.
A steam engine, 1700 years before James Watt. How did it work? And if they had it, why didn't the Ptolemies kickstart an industrial revolution?
Well, the aeolipile was essentially a hollow sphere mounted on two pivots that fed steam into it from a pressurized kettle underneath. The steam escaped through two opposing curved nozzles on the sphere, causing it to spin rapidly. It was a beautiful piece of physics in it.
So why did it remain a temple toy used for theatrics? To maybe magically open a temple door rather than a machine used to pump water or drive mills?
A few major reasons. First, the lack of societal need. The ancient economy was powered by human and animal muscle, and crucially, slave labor was cheap and abundant, eliminating the economic incentive for power generation. Second, the limitations of metallurgy. Ancient engineers struggled to cast iron and bronze with sufficient precision and strength to handle the high pressures required for true industrial-scale steam power.
So it was brilliant, but ahead of its material capabilities and its economic requirements.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just the intellectual feats. The city itself was a monumental work of engineering, demonstrating the Ptolemies' commercial. We were talking about the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders.
The lighthouse was a demonstration of absolute global confidence. Ptolemy I started it, and it was eventually completed under Ptolemy II. It was built on the island of Pharos, about 3/4 of a mile off the coast.
And the genius of the location was that the island had been linked to the mainland by the massive Heptastadium Causeway. This causeway, nearly a mile long, essentially created two semi-artificial harbors, the Great Harbor to the east and the Old Port to the west, allowing massive protected ship traffic regardless of wind direction.
The lighthouse structure itself, built by Sostratus of Tynus around 290 BC, was a technological and structural marvel. Sources place it around 110 meters high, making it one of the tallest human-made structures in the world for centuries.
And it was organized in three tapering tiers: a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a cylindrical top section. The signal came from the top, right?
Correct. It contained mirrors, likely polished bronze, used to protect the light from massive, permanently burning fires. This system allowed ships to be guided by day with smoke and by night with firelight up to 35 miles away. It was adorned with massive statues of Poseidon and his son Triton, symbolizing the city's dominion over the sea.
The lighthouse defined Alexandria for over a millennium. It was the longest surviving of the seven wonders, apart from the Great Pyramid. It wasn't fully destroyed until the major Crete earthquake in 1303 AD. It was a tangible symbol of stability and power.
But the golden age of stability, prosperity, and unparalleled intellectual output, it didn't. Ptolemy III died in 222 BC, and that essentially marked the beginning of the end for Ptolemaic imperial power and stability.
And the decline was dramatic and, sadly, in many ways, self-inflicted. Ptolemy IV, who reigned until 204 BC, was described by sources as a deeply incompetent ruler, far more interested in lavish rituals and banquets than in governance.
He famously handed over the actual day-to-day management of the kingdom to his sycophantic courtier. The most notorious was Agathocles, whose sister was the king's mistress. This kind of reliance on favorites allowed the court to become corrupt and directionless.
And that weak rule had immediate consequences, both internationally and domestically.
Internationally, the wars against the Seleucid Empire continued, and now, under incompetent leadership, the Ptolemies lost vast amounts of territory in the Levant. Domestically, and far more critically, a massive native revolt broke out in Upper Egypt.
This was the revolt led by Horowenifer. It shows that the policy of cultural osmosis was failing in the deep countryside, where Egyptian identity remained strong, and people were tired of Greek administration and taxation.
And this deteriorating situation only intensified under Ptolemy IV's son and heir, Ptolemy V, who came to the throne as a child in 204 BC. By the time he died in 180 BC, the kingdom was fractured, losing external territory and facing internal upheaval. New local breakaway states were appearing, like the independent Jewish kingdom that emerged in Judea after the Maccabean revolt.
But the political decline wasn't just external pressure. The court itself became a hotbed of internal strife and bewildering family politics. The century following Ptolemy V's death was astonishingly dysfunctional.
It was defined by perpetual murderous rivalries between brothers. Initially, the rivalry was between Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VII. And to complicate matters further, Queen Cleopatra II, their sister, became the most powerful political force in the generation.
Cleopatra II is a great example of the political insanity. She ruled for 6 decades between 175 and 150. She served as sister wife to both brothers at different times and even ruled independently as queen for a period when she expelled.
The genealogy is mind-bent, and it was meant to be confusing to outsiders, but it was all about keeping power concentrated within a tiny Macedonian elite. Consider Cleopatra III, the daughter of Ptolemy VI, Cleopatra II. She ended up marrying Ptolemy VII.
Wait, let me make sure the listener is following that. The man she married, Ptolemy VII, was not only her uncle because he was her mother's brother, but he had also previously been married to her own mother, making him her stepfather.
It's a lot to keep track of. It's political stability via a soap opera. And this raises a really important question that the sources bring, the role of incest. While this custom was initially adopted by the Ptolemies to mimic the pharaohs and demonstrate divine status, it was now being carried out relentless, generation after generation.
And we know from a modern medical perspective that severe inbreeding increases the risk of genetic disorders, leading to everything from intellectual disabilities and developmental issues to physical abnormalities.
Exactly. And while we cannot definitively prove that genetics were the sole driver of the political decline, relentless Roman pressure and bad geopolitical luck certainly played a role. It's undeniable that the political competence of the later Ptolemies declined dramatically. They were fighting and murdering each other while the world around them was being swallowed by Rome.
And that ominous shadow from the west was beginning to fall hard. While the Ptolemies were busy with their murderous family feud, Rome had cemented its control over the western Mediterranean by defeating Carthage and was now aggressively turning its...
The rise of Rome could not have come at a worse time. By 200 BC, Rome was waging war on Macedon and the Seleucids, systematically breaking down the other Hellenistic successor state. Initially, they only wanted tribute, but soon they were acquiring territory and establishing client kingdoms.
And the Ptolemies, tragic, facilitated their own demise by constantly petitioning Rome for aid in their internal squabble. Instead of uniting against the common threat, they invited the wolf into the house, settle family arguments.
And that reliance turned Egypt into a de facto vassal state. This means Rome didn't formally annex it yet, but they exerted control over policy, succession, and finance. Roman diplomats and tax collectors were often present, ensuring Rome's interests.
We see this control clearly in 80 BC. After a round of court murder, Queen Berenice III was murdered, and Ptolemy XI was swiftly lynched in retaliation. The reason this was so politically catastrophic,
because the Roman dictator at the time, Cornelius Sulla, had unilaterally imposed Ptolemy XI on the Egyptian throne, believing he would be a biddable vassal. When he was lynched, it was an offense against Rome itself, not just the Ptolemaic line.
The message was clear. Rome dictated who sat on the throne. They directly annexed the wealthy Ptolemaic possession of Cyprus in 58 BC. In the same year, Ptolemy XII was deposed in a palace coup and immediately fled to Rome to beg for aid, bringing his young daughter, Cleopatra VII, with.
The Ptolemaic kings were now spending more time bribing senators in Rome for their lives than actually ruling in Alexandria. They were functionally bankrupt and dependent.
And the final act of this astonishing 3th-century dynasty centers entirely on that one surviving individual, Cleopatra VII, who returned to power after her father's death and inherited the mess. She succeeded alongside her brother and husband, Ptolemy XIII, leading immediately and predictably to civil war between.
And it was during this civil war that her destiny became completely entangled with the terminal phase of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, fresh off his victory over his rival, Pompey the Great.
Pompey himself met a brutal end, murdered upon landing on the coast of Egypt by agents of Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favor with the victorious.
That miscalculation by Ptolemy XIII was Cleopatra's opportunity. She famously smuggled herself into Caesar's presence, in some sources, rolled up in a rug to bypass her brother's guard. She seduced Caesar, securing his military support to win the civil war against her brother and solidifying her control of Egypt.
And she didn't just secure power. She secured the dynasty's future by giving birth to Caesar's only known biological son, Caesarion. She had effectively merged her royal line with the most powerful man in the world.
But Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44. His death immediately triggered a fresh power struggle in Rome for absolute control, throwing Cleopatra's plans into turmoil.
The contention for power boiled down to two men: Octavian, Caesar's very young, politically astute great nephew, and Mark Antony, the much older, more experienced general who had been right.
Cleopatra made a massive political gamble. She bet on the older, more seasoned general, Mark Antony. By the late 40s BC, she and Antony were in a deep personal and political relationship, eventually having 3 children.
This relationship fundamentally changed the geopolitical map. Antony essentially established Alexandria as the capital of his eastern dominion, treating Cleopatra as a true queen and political partner, while Octavian controlled the West.
This was a colossal moment in world history. Had Antony succeeded in defeating Octavian, the Ptolemaic Dynasty could have become the eastern half of the Roman imperial family. Alexandria, with its wealth, its trade networks, intellectual capital, might have easily supplanted Rome as the capital of the new empire.
But Octavian was a master manipulator in the political arena. He successfully convinced the Roman Senate that Antony had gone native, that he'd abandoned his Roman values, and was falling under the spell of a dangerous foreign.
The official war declared in 32 BC, was not waged against Antony, but against Cleopatra, framed as a defense of Roman honor. The final military clash was decided swiftly at the massive naval battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BC.
Antony and Cleopatra were decisively defeated and fled back. A year later, as Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, Antony took his own life. Cleopatra followed suit about a week later in mid-August 30 BC, choosing suicide over being paraded as a captive through Rome.
And with that dramatic climax, after 275 years, the Ptolemaic Dynasty, Egypt came directly under Roman rule, overseen not by a Senate-appointed governor, but by a special prefect appointed directly by Octavian. 3 years later, the Roman Republic also reached its terminal point with the rise of Octavian, who became the first Roman emperor, Augustus.
There were a few loose familial ends that Octavian needed to tie up to ensure the dynasty.
Indeed. Octavian viewed Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as a direct threat to his own legitimacy as Caesar's heir. He ordered Caesarion's swift murder soon after Cleopatra's death. Antony's 2 sons also disappeared under unclear circumstances.
But Antony and Cleopatra's daughter, Cleopatra Selene, survived. Octavian brought her and her twin brother back to Rome, where they were raised by.
She went on to marry King Juba II of Mauritania, a client kingdom of Rome in North Africa, roughly modern Algeria. This was a strategic political marriage by Octavian to remove her from the power.
And her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, ruled that kingdom until 40 AD, extending a scion of the Ptolemaic line through the female lineage for 2 more decades before Rome eventually annexed that as well. A small final flicker of the once.
Meanwhile, Egypt's role was entirely redefined by Rome. It became the most vital Roman province, known as the breadbasket of Rome. The wealth generated by the Nile's immense agricultural output was now systematically shipped to Italy to feed the massive population of Rome.
And the Romans, shrewdly, inherited and dramatically expanded the lucrative Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade system that the Ptolemies had so brilliantly established.
Roman shipping expeditions grew exponentially. They used the astronomical and geographical knowledge aggregated in Alexandria to perfect navigation across the Arabian Sea. Trade flourished so widely that Roman coins were commonplace in India, and even a Roman temple dedicated to Augustus was established for visiting merchants in western India. The trade routes extended all the way to China.
So even though the ruling family died, the city itself retained immense importance. Alexandria remained the second largest city in the entire Roman Empire, after Rome itself, and it absolutely retained its position as the intellectual center of the Greek-speaking world century.
If you were a serious scholar studying geography, mathematics, astronomy, or physics during the Roman Empire, you traveled to Alexandria. Rome was the political and military capital, but Alexandria was the academic capital.
It continued to produce major scholars, such as Claudius Ptolemy, the geographer and astronomer who organized much of the geographical knowledge of the world.
And we also see the great Neoplatonic philosophers of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD keeping the philosophical flame alive, and of course the famed female mathematician and astronomer.
But the city suffered a final, profound cultural tragedy. The rise of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century led to orchestrated attacks on the city's pagan nations and
the last major organized part of the Great Library, which by then had mostly migrated to a smaller section housed in the Serapeum, the great temple built by the III, was destroyed in 390. This attack was encouraged by the Christian patriarch Theophilus, who actively directed the campaign against pagan idols and temples.
That destruction, 7 centuries after the library was first conceived, effectively brought an end to Alexandria as the singular greatest center.
The city remained a major port under Roman and Byzantine rule until the Arab Muslims conquered it in 641 AD, finally shifting Egypt's political and cultural center of gravity southwards and eastwards to the founding of Cairo.
The Ptolemaic era was an extraordinary historical achievement spanning 275 years, marked by a level of cultural development and knowledge acquisition that feels almost anachronistic for its time.
It was completely unexpected. A seasoned traveler to Egypt in 350 BC would never have believed that a century later, a brand new city would be founded at the Delta, where people spoke Greek, pioneered human dissection, and became the intellectual capital of the world.
They took the chaos of the Diadochi Wars and, thanks to the strategic genius and long reign of Ptolemy I and II, created the most powerful and scientifically advanced successor state, only rivaled by the Seleucid Empire.
But wars aside, the paramount legacy remains Alexandria and the intellectual culture that developed there. Ptolemy I, II, and III provided the focus and the funding for an intellectual community that produced scientific discoveries comparable only to the peak achievements of the Arab scholars of Baghdad centuries later, and eclipsing even the achievements of Athens. This cultural creation is the enduring legacy, overshadowing even the famous dramatic fall under Cleopatra VII.
So, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have this extraordinary cultural and scientific dominance of Alexandria producing pre-scientific rebel discoveries, and yet you're witnessing the rapid political decline and internal decay of the the ruling family through ineptitude and inbreeding in the second.
The key question remains, was the Ptolemies' intense focus and vast funding for knowledge and culture, the library, the Mausoleum, the lighthouse, an intentional strategy to compensate for their loss of military and political control, a way to maintain prestige? Or did the universal knowledge they aggregated simply ensure the city's intellectual survival and commercial resilience for centuries after the corrupt dynasty had dramatically fallen?
So what does this all mean? Did the library's pursuit of knowledge ultimately help the city survive its founders, proving that knowledge itself is the most lasting form of currency? Something for you to ponder long after this deep dive.